Welcome to the first episode in a Legendarium series about the 18th century vampire scare. In part 1, we will talk about the roots of vampire lore and why so many people in Eastern Europe during the 18th century became convinced that the dead rose from the grave. Darkness and death have long been the cornerstones of some of humanity's deepest fears. Since prehistory, humanity has imagined supernatural creatures which feasted upon the blood or life force of the living. Humanity's first civilization, the Sumerians, believed that a monster called Lamashtu had the head of a lion and the body of a donkey. Ancient Greeks believed in the strigus, a blood-drinking bird. In the Philippines, storytellers told of the Manananggal, a woman who could sever her upper torso and spread bat-like wings to fly. All these very different creatures had one common characteristic. They sustained themselves with the blood or life force of human beings. Humanity long understood that losing blood could deprive a person of life, so it seemed logical to early humans that imbibing blood could prolong life, however unnatural that life might be. Various traits have come and gone with the ages for vampires. Indeed, murky eyewitness accounts of revenants spread throughout Western Europe during the 12th century. These revenants are described as spreading plague wherever they go and beating their victims to death. When stabbed, blood gushed from them like an exploding leech. Our modern idea of a vampire, shown in works like Dracula and Nosferatu, formed during the 18th century. Though the educated classes of Europe valued empirical science, new knowledge often mingled with medieval superstition. Medical authorities in the 1670s wrote Latin treatises about grave eating, in which people exhumed corpses to find that the dead had been eating their own shrouds, supposedly. Some accounts even told of undead corpses feasting upon their own limbs and bowels. To many people of 18th century Europe, whether prince or pauper, the vampire remained an unquestioned reality. They went by many names, like Vampire, Vrekalakas, Nosferatu, Strigoi, or Ubor. Eastern Europe during this time made for a particularly grim place to live. The population still dealt with the effects of the Little Ice Age, which meant poor harvests, high food prices, and epidemic diseases citing a weakened population. With many unexplained deaths from famine, plague, and war, people unsurprisingly turned to ancient vampire myths to explain their misfortunes. Each Eastern European nation had its own vampire lore, but the Moroi among the Romani and the Albanian Lugat gave the vampire its modern traits. These include the vampire being undead, nocturnal, and endowed with the power of shape-shifting and sometimes supernatural strength. The first documented case occurred in Croatia. Jure Grando is recorded to have lived in a small village called Kringa during the 17th century. Little is known about Grando's life, and he may have just been an ordinary villager prior to his death. Yet shortly after Grando's burial, locals reported seeing the deceased Grando wandering around the village, knocking on the doors of certain houses. In time, Grando began to prey upon young widows. The mayor of the village, Miho Radetic, gathered a group of brave young men to hunt down Grando. One of his men, Stephen Milosic, opened Grando's grave and beheaded him with an axe. The vampire supposedly made a loud cry, and blood gushed forth from his neck. The men then covered the grave and ended the afterlife of Jure Grando. Yet the vampirism phenomenon continued. As early as 1698, a Frenchman named Mercure Galland wrote of vampires, "They appear from midday to midnight, and come to drink the blood of living people and animals in such great abundance that sometimes it comes out of their mouths, their noses, and especially their ears. Sometimes the body swims in the blood, which is spilled out into its coffin." In 1725, the Croatian village of Istria became home to another documented vampire attack. Petar Blagojevich, after his death, knocked on the door of his widow just after his own funeral, demanding his shoes before he attempted to strangle her. Blagojevich remained active over the next 9 nights, attacking 9 more villagers. Upon waking, each victim reported that Blagojevich had laid upon them and attempted to strangle them. When the villagers, led by a local official named Frombald, dug up Blagojevich's grave, they found that he had grown longer hair and nails. They saw blood around his mouth, and he appeared alive. When they staked him, blood gushed out of his orifices. Around the same time, Croatia also saw the strange case of Milo Sisak. A peasant and soldier, he supposedly died while cutting hay. And after his death, people began to die in the surrounding area, and many believed that Milos had returned to prey upon those he once loved. Yet his case would be overshadowed by the Blagojevich case because of the power of the press. Frombald's report, published in newspapers across Europe, created a continental sensation and brought the idea of vampirism into mainstream thought among literate Europeans. Europe's vampire craze in the midst of the Enlightenment and scientific revolution had begun. That wraps things up for this episode of The Legendarium. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.